She thought the worst thing an HOA could do was send nasty letters about weeds in the yard. But one morning, she opened her mailbox to find a notice that would change her life forever. A bill she didn't even know existed had spiraled into something far more dangerous, something that put her home, her safety, and even her future on the line. Neighbors whispered, board members smirked, and the rules she never agreed to were now weaponized against her. What started as a small oversight would soon snowball into a nightmare of fines, threats, and humiliation. And when the HOA finally made its move, the result was so outrageous, so unbelievable, that it left the entire community in shock. How far can an HOA really go when they decide you're the enemy? At first, life on Willow Creek Lane seemed picture-perfect. The kind of neighborhood with manicured lawns, kids riding their bikes until the streetlights came on, and a calm, almost storybook rhythm to the days. For years, Maria had loved her little corner of the cul-de-sac, a modest home with a front porch where she sipped her morning coffee and waved to passing neighbors. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. After years of saving, it felt like a sanctuary, the place where her family's memories would take root. The homeowners association was always there in the background, like an invisible set of hands quietly shaping the rules of daily life. Signs had to be a certain size. Lawns trimmed to a certain height. Even the paint colors were regulated. To most, these seemed like harmless guidelines to keep the neighborhood looking nice. But to Maria, they always felt a little too sharp, as though someone was waiting for the chance to remind her of the fine print. Still, she went about her life, working long shifts, keeping her home tidy, and trying not to draw attention. But the HOA noticed everything. The faded shutters. The slightly cracked driveway. Even the flowers she planted without formal approval. Small things, easy to overlook. But in this neighborhood, nothing stayed small for long. The board members, often seen whispering at community meetings or peering over fences, prided themselves on protecting property values. Yet beneath their polished smiles was a sense of control that hung over every resident. And while Maria tried to ignore it, she could feel the weight of those watchful eyes. What she didn't know was that a simple oversight, something so ordinary it could happen to anyone, was about to draw her into a fight she never imagined. A fight not just for her home, but for her dignity against the system that seemed determined to break her. At first, the letter looked ordinary. Just another folded notice slipped into the mailbox, stamped with the HOA's emblem in bold, official lettering. Maria expected it to be the usual, reminders about trash can placement, or a warning about leaves left too long on the curb. But as she opened the envelope, her chest tightened. This wasn't a polite reminder. It was a violation notice. According to the board, her shutters, which had faded slightly under the summer sun, were now non-compliant. She was ordered to repaint them in an approved color, within 10 days, or face fines of $50 per day. She stared at the paper in disbelief. 10 days? She worked back-to-back shifts at the hospital. Finding the time, let alone the money, felt impossible. Still, she tried to comply, rushing to the hardware store only to discover that the HOA's approved palette was custom-ordered and far more expensive than standard paint. That was the first time she realized this wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. But the paint was only the beginning. Weeks later came another notice. This time, the HOA claimed her driveway had visible cracks that could diminish property values. The repair deadline, 30 days. The cost estimate, nearly $2,000. Maria pleaded with them, explaining that she simply didn't have the funds. But the letters kept coming, each one harsher, each one demanding compliance. Soon, the fines began stacking up, $100 here, $150 there. Within a month, the tally had already passed $600. Maria tried to keep her composure, but the constant stream of notices felt suffocating. Each time she walked to her mailbox, she braced herself for another blow. Neighbors began to notice, whispering at block parties, their smiles growing strained as they distanced themselves. No one wanted to get on the wrong side of the board. And then, things escalated further. The HOA sent inspectors, volunteers from the very same board that had been targeting her. They circled her property with clipboards, jotting down every perceived imperfection. A patch of grass slightly browner than the rest. A flower bed that extended a few inches beyond regulation. Even a welcome mat they claimed was not in harmony with the community aesthetic. Every minor detail became ammunition. Maria felt hunted. The fines grew to over $1,200, and late fees compounded daily. She reached out to the board president, hoping to find a reason, but the response was chillingly dismissive. All homeowners are subject to the same rules. Compliance ensures fairness. Fairness. The word stung. Nothing about this felt fair. One night, exhausted after a double shift, Maria returned home to find a bright orange notice taped to her front door. The HOA had scheduled a hearing, a tribunal, essentially, where she would be summoned to explain her repeated noncompliance. Failure to appear could result in legal action. That was the moment fear set in. She imagined walking into a room filled with stone-faced board members, each one armed with stacks of paper documenting her so-called failures. It wasn't a conversation. It was a trial. And the outcome was already written. When the hearing came, her worst fears were confirmed. The board sat behind a long table, papers spread before them, their expressions unreadable. They listed her violations one by one, each accusation delivered with surgical precision. Maria tried to defend herself. She explained her financial struggles, her work hours, her attempts to comply. But her words fell into silence. They weren't listening. By the end, they informed her that her unpaid fines now totaled nearly $3,000, and unless she settled immediately, the HOA would place a lien on her home. A lien. Over chipped paint and a cracked driveway. A lien. Over chipped paint and a cracked driveway. Maria walked out of that meeting with trembling hands. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just harassment. This was war. But the harassment didn't stop at official notices. Soon, neighbors she had once chatted with began avoiding her. Some even sided with the board, parroting their language about community standards. It was as if the entire neighborhood had turned against her. She began to notice cars slowing as they passed her house, residents staring at her lawn as if it were a crime scene. The isolation grew unbearable. And then came the final blow, the lien notice itself. It arrived by certified mail, the words cold and clinical. The HOA had officially taken the first step toward foreclosing on her home. Her sanctuary. The place she had worked years to afford. The lien meant that unless she paid every cent, the fines, the fees, the administrative costs, her house could legally be seized and sold at auction. And the board had the full power of the law behind them. Panic coursed through her. She called lawyers, but most demanded retainers she couldn't possibly afford. She begged for more time, but the HOA refused. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Her debt ballooned, fed by daily penalties that seemed designed to crush her spirit. Maria tried one last desperate measure. She scraped together enough to cover part of the balance, hoping to show good faith. But the board rejected her partial payment, insisting that nothing less than full settlement would stop the foreclosure process. It was as though they wanted her to fail. By now, Maria could barely sleep. She lived in constant fear of the next letter, the next knock at her door. She replayed every moment, every decision, wondering how something as small as faded shutters had spiraled into a battle for her very home. And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, she discovered something even more shocking. The HOA had scheduled her foreclosure auction. Her home would be sold, not for its value, not even for what she owed, but to the highest bidder, no matter how low. The date was set. The clock was ticking. Her neighbors carried on with their lives as though nothing was happening, their lawns pristine, their smiles brittle. But for Maria, every passing day felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. She fought to find someone, anyone, who would help. She contacted consumer rights groups, filed complaints, even tried to rally other homeowners. But fear kept everyone quiet. The sense of betrayal cut deep. This was supposed to be a community. Instead, it was a machine, grinding her down until she was nothing more than an example. As the auction date drew closer, Maria faced the unthinkable, losing her home over a few $1,000s in disputed fines. The thought of strangers walking through her front door, claiming the walls she had painted, the floors she had scrubbed, the memories she had built, it was unbearable. But the most shocking twist was still to come. Because when her home finally went to auction, the sale price wasn't just low. It was insulting. A slap in the face that revealed just how broken the system truly was. Cliffhanger transition. What happened next would expose the HOA's tactics for what they really were. Not about rules, not about community, but about power. And the price they sold her home for? It left everyone asking, how could this possibly be legal? The morning of the auction arrived with an eerie stillness. Maria barely slept the night before, pacing the creaking floors of the home she feared she would lose. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper memories. The kitchen where she had celebrated birthdays, the living room where she'd fallen asleep watching late-night TV, the porch where she waved to neighbors before they turned against her. And now, all of it was on the line, not because she failed to pay her mortgage, but because of fines she never believed could carry such devastating weight. She drove to the county courthouse, hands trembling against the steering wheel. The sky was overcast, the air heavy, as though even nature understood the storm she was walking into. Inside, the corridors buzzed with the echo of footsteps and hushed conversations. Investors and speculators crowded the auction room, men and women clutching clipboards, eyeing opportunities like vultures circling their prey. To them, these homes weren't sanctuaries. They were bargains. When Maria's case was called, the clerk read aloud the details in a detached monotone: the address, the lien amount, the foreclosure authorization by the HOA. No mention of the years she spent paying her mortgage, keeping her home, or the countless nights of overtime that had built it brick by brick. To the court, it was just another item on the list. The opening bid, $4.90. Gasps rippled through the room. A number so absurd, so insulting, that for a moment Maria thought she had misheard. $4.90, less than the cost of a cup of coffee. Less than the price of parking downtown. That was what her home, her life, had been reduced to in the cold machinery of HOA power. The HOA board members weren't in the room, but their presence was everywhere. She could picture them, sitting smugly behind their polished desks, congratulating themselves on enforcing the rules. They had turned her life upside down, and now they dared to claim victory. But the auction wasn't the end. As news spread, the absurdity of the sale caught fire. Local reporters picked up the story. Headlines screamed the numbers: $800 in fees, home sold for $4.90. Outrage spilled across the community. Neighbors who once ignored her plight now whispered in shock. Some were embarrassed, others frightened. If this could happen to Maria, what was stopping it from happening to them? Suddenly, the board's carefully constructed facade of authority began to crack. At the next HOA meeting, Maria showed up, not as a victim, but as a voice of defiance. The room was packed, curiosity and tension buzzing in the air. Residents filled the metal chairs, their eyes darting between Maria and the board. The president, a man known for his clipped tone and stiff suits, tried to maintain order. But Maria wasn't the same woman who once trembled opening her mailbox. She stood tall, clutching the lien notices, the violation letters, the foreclosure documents, a stack of paper that told the story of abuse, intimidation, and unchecked power. Her voice didn't shake. You took my home for $4.90, she said, holding the room's attention like a flame in the dark. $4.90. Do you call that protecting property values? Do you call that fairness? Or is this just about control? A murmur rolled through the crowd. The board members shifted in their seats, their confident expressions faltering. For the first time, they weren't the unquestioned authority. They were the accused. Maria laid out the timeline, the arbitrary paint demands, the inflated fines, the rejection of her partial payments. Every detail struck like a hammer. And as she spoke, heads nodded in the audience. Eyes widened. Residents who had once looked away now saw their own vulnerabilities reflected in her story. The president tried to cut her off, banging the gavel, insisting she was out of order. But the people weren't buying it. A voice from the back shouted, "Answer her question!" Another followed. "How many others have you threatened with foreclosure?" The tide had turned. That meeting became a spectacle, not of Maria's defeat, but of the HOA's unraveling. Cameras rolled as reporters documented the scene. By the end of the night, board members were red-faced, cornered by questions they could no longer dodge. What was once their strongest weapon, the veil of authority, had been ripped away under the weight of public scrutiny. But the true turning point came days later, in court. Maria, with the help of a pro bono attorney who had seen her story on the news, challenged the sale. The attorney argued that the process violated state laws, that the HOA had abused its authority, that the sale price was unconscionable. For once, the law was on her side. In a packed courtroom, the judge leaned forward, his voice sharp. $4.90 is not a fair sale. This is not justice. This is exploitation. The gavel fell again, but this time, it wasn't to take something from Maria. It was to return what should never have been stolen. Her home. The relief crashed over her like a wave, tears streaming as the ruling was declared. The audience, residents, reporters, even strangers, erupted in applause. It wasn't just about Maria anymore. It was about every homeowner who had ever felt powerless against an HOA, every family who feared losing their home to technicalities and petty power plays. For the board, it was the ultimate humiliation. Their tactics exposed, their authority weakened, their reputations shattered in public view. What they had hoped would be a quiet example of control had instead become a rallying cry for reform. And for Maria, standing outside the courthouse in the cool afternoon air, it was the moment she realized she had won not only her home, but something even greater. The truth was finally on her side. But victory, as sweet as it was, did not erase the scars. The battle had drained her, left her weary, and reminded her of just how fragile security could be under the shadow of unchecked power. Still, as she looked at the reporters waiting for her statement, the neighbors who now met her eyes with respect instead of judgment, she knew the fight wasn't just personal anymore. It was bigger. Her story had become a symbol. The courthouse steps were crowded with voices, cameras, and the hum of anticipation. When Maria emerged, she was no longer the frightened homeowner who once stood alone at her mailbox, clutching violation notices with trembling hands. She had become the face of something bigger, a living reminder of what unchecked HOA power could do, and a symbol of how far ordinary people were willing to go to fight back. Reporters swarmed her with questions. How did she feel? What would she do next? Did she believe the system was fair? Maria didn't sugarcoat her answer. "I almost lost everything over a few $100s in fines," she said firmly. "This isn't about paint colors or cracked driveways. This is about power. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone here." That soundbite spread like wildfire. Local newscasts replayed it again and again. Editorials appeared in city papers, criticizing HOAs for overreach and demanding reform. Online forums lit up with homeowners sharing their own stories, some eerily similar to Maria's. She had cracked open a door, and countless others were now stepping through it. But while the public cheered her courtroom victory, Maria's personal life was far from simple. The months of stress had left deep marks. Her savings were depleted. Her trust in neighbors was shattered. For weeks after regaining her home, she jumped at every letter in the mail, half expecting another notice, another threat. Even the quiet creak of her front porch at night reminded her of inspectors lurking with clipboards. It took time to relearn the simple act of peace. Yet, as weeks turned into months, she found herself reclaiming small joys. She planted flowers again, not the regulation-approved kind, but bright, defiant blooms in colors that made her smile. She painted her shutters a shade just outside the HOA palette, daring them to try again. And this time, the board stayed silent. Their confidence, once unshakable, had been broken in court and under the glare of public outrage. The board president, who had smirked through hearings and waved off her pleas, quietly resigned within months. Other members followed, their reputations tarnished by the scandal. At the next community election, a new wave of residents ran for seats on the board, campaigning on promises of fairness, transparency, and compassion. The tone of the neighborhood shifted. People who once whispered in fear now spoke openly about their frustrations. The unspoken rule of silence had been shattered. For Maria, that was the greatest victory of all, knowing her fight had not been in vain. Still, she didn't stop there. She began attending city council meetings, advocating for stronger homeowner protections. She told her story at public forums, warning about how easily minor disputes could escalate into life-shattering battles. Slowly, she transformed from a reluctant fighter into a passionate advocate. Her case even caught the attention of state legislators, who cited her ordeal when introducing bills aimed at curbing HOA foreclosure powers. They argued that no one should lose a home over minor fines, that checks and balances were needed to protect residents from predatory practices. Maria's name was spoken not just in her neighborhood, but in government chambers. Yet, for all the progress, the scars remained. There were nights when she still woke in a cold sweat, heart racing with the memory of that gavel slamming down. She still remembered the humiliation of standing in front of a roomful of neighbors who had treated her like a criminal. The sense of betrayal never fully left her. Some wounds, after all, do not close neatly. But with every passing day, she also grew stronger. Stronger in her conviction that one voice can ripple outward. Stronger in her belief that communities could be places of trust, not fear. Stronger in her ability to look back at her darkest hours and see not just the pain, but the resilience that carried her through. The impact of her story extended far beyond her cul-de-sac. News outlets continued covering similar cases. Homeowners blindsided by liens, families forced out of houses for trivial reasons. Maria's name often appeared in those articles, either as a cautionary tale or as a voice of hope. Advocacy groups reached out to her, asking her to share her experience in campaigns against HOA abuse. She accepted, not because she sought attention, but because she knew how many people felt silenced. She had been silenced once too, until she refused to be anymore. And for her neighbors, the lesson was impossible to ignore. They no longer saw HOAs as unquestionable authorities, but as organizations accountable to the very residents they claimed to serve. Fear gave way to vigilance, compliance to resistance. No one wanted to relive what had happened to Maria. Years later, the memory of that $4.90 auction still hung like a shadow over the community. But it also became a rallying cry, proof that injustice can backfire, that power unchecked can crumble under its own arrogance. Maria never forgot the moment she stood in court and heard the judge's words. "This is not justice. This is exploitation." To her, those words became a kind of armor, a reminder that truth could prevail even when the odds seemed impossible. And perhaps that is the true resolution of her story. Not simply that she kept her home. Not simply that the board lost face. But she turned her private nightmare into a public reckoning. The fight left her tired, yes. but it also left her unbreakable. As she stood once more on her porch, gazing at the street where it had all begun, she realized something profound. The house was still hers. The memories still lived within its walls. The laughter, the struggles, the everyday moments that made it a home, those could never be sold, not for $4, not for $4 million. Because a home is more than wood and paint. It's dignity. It's belonging. It's the freedom to live without fear of someone else's petty rules defining your worth. And so, when people asked her what she learned from it all, Maria's answer was simple but powerful. I learned that a home can be stolen on paper, but only if you let them steal your voice. And I refuse to let mine be taken. Her ordeal raised a question that every homeowner should ask themselves. If an HOA can take a home over $800 and sell it for $4.90, what protections do you believe should exist to stop this from happening again?